Friends, now we have with us Harsh Pant. Now, I associate Harsh with King's College London, where he worked for a very long time, on which he had a very significant influence. Please, can we try to be as quiet as possible with the service? Harsh has just written a book on Indian foreign policy and everything surrounding it. It's not just Indian foreign policy. And the interesting thing about the book to me was what you told me about it. You started it thinking you were going to take it in a certain direction and wound up taking it in other directions. And I wondered whether you'd tell us a bit about the contour of the book and how it came to evolve in the way it did.
Thank you, David. And I think it's a bit difficult to talk cogently about anything Indian foreign policy or any particular academic aspect, because after you have had a few rounds of wine with your food, so I'll try to be cogent as much as I can. I think the idea initially was because this was a commission project. Cambridge University Press wanted to look at the impact of Mr. Modi on India's foreign policy, and Mr. Modi sells. You know, some of us may like him, some of us may not like him, but I think the reality in the publishing world is that he makes publishing houses a lot of money, and I think that meant that CUP was. Despite being a very academic university press, they were interested in the impact of an individual on the trajectory of a foreign policy. And I think this came to me around 2016. So it was very early on in his tenure. And the idea was to look at what Mr. Modi may or may not have contributed to the trajectory of Indian foreign policy. And this was particularly difficult to do for an academic because I was being asked to look into different aspects of Indian foreign policy in a slightly more academically rigorous manner. And the time frame was not that big to sort of gauge the impact. I think even today, if you will, take the discourse on Indian foreign policy, you will see that there are wide-ranging opinions on what impact it will have. And I think you will get an assessment on Mr. Modi's impact on Indian foreign policy only a few years down the line. It's very difficult to make that assessment today. So I think what we ended up doing was look at the larger sort of scope of what is happening to the field, to the state of the field in Indian foreign policy. And I think what I decided was to look at two aspects. One was there are a lot of very interesting emerging voices that are coming up in Indian foreign policy literature. Academically, you have some young scholars doing a lot of very interesting work theoretically. So whereas the initial debate on Indian foreign policy was largely about structure versus ideas, now you have a lot of people doing critical geography, for example. How does that impact a debate on territoriality in debates, questions around that? You have some very interesting voices doing looking at the questions around foreign policy analysis, which is very difficult in the Indian context because the black box is quite black. It's very difficult to open up the black box of Indian foreign policy decision making. And I think what we have seen over the years, including some of my students in King's, that they did a lot of interesting work on opening up this black box, trying to understand how actual decisions are being made in the context of Indian foreign policy debates and discourse. And I think all of that I wanted to capture in this book. So the first part of this book is largely about the theoretical evolution. And as an academic, I think I'm particularly proud of that aspect because I think that's a very important part of what we do as academics, trying to shape up the state of the field and to see that the discourse on Indian foreign policy and the literature on Indian foreign policy becomes probably as rigorous as it is in other domains. And as of now, it's not there. So that was the first aspect. The second was a lot of interesting issue areas were emerging. So for example, the whole debate on Indo-Pacific. Now, if you look at the debate today, it's a very interesting debate around how you map out your geography. It's not simply Indo-Pacific, it's also related to, for example, what India is trying to do with BIMSTEC, for example. How do you move away from west to the east? And can you reimagine your strategic geography? And that's a very interesting debate happening in the Indian strategic community. But it was sort of not being captured by the academics. So a lot of the questions, for example, again, the question on what India's response is to questions around responsibility to protect. Now that is a debate again which is emerging, which is there, and again the impact of, for example, diaspora. And now that's a debate that we have had for a long time as to exactly what sort of role diaspora plays in shaping Indian foreign policy, and we wanted to look at in greater detail as to what exactly is happening. So there are a lot of issue areas which perhaps are new, and some of them are being reevaluated. For example, non-alignment. It's a long-standing debate. You have had, under the previous government, we have had non-alignment 2.0 document. This government never talks about non-alignment, but we have an entirely different space being created for example, whether new sorts of partnerships are important in terms of rejuvenating Indian foreign policy discourse. And then I think even traditional issues like nuclear deterrence. Very interesting debate happening in India on what is the future of India's nuclear deterrence. It's being captured. We have had vigorous debates on this issue 1 year back with Vipin Narang making a statement somewhere and then being captured by what people like General Nangal was saying here in clause. And I think that expands somehow we wanted to capture in one book. It's a white canvas. But I think as an academic, it gives me great satisfaction that we were able to bring it all together in one volume for those who are interested in engaging with India's changing trajectory. And I must add that while we started off saying that, look, it's too early, we really cannot evaluate Mr. Modi's impact on foreign policy, but there are hints here and there in the book which would tell you a very interesting story that leadership does play a role in certain aspects. In soft power, for example, there's an interesting chapter on power and how India is reconceptualizing power. And the role, how do you think about power? Traditionally, we just look at capabilities and whether India is able to project those capabilities abroad. I think this government has given new impetus to soft power in some respects. How do you engage with Southeast Asia, for example? Given your cultural, historical linkages with the region, can you reinvigorate that? I think that debate has come back into the mix in terms of when we look at, as analysts, when we look at the trajectory of Indian foreign policy. And to me, as an academic, as a student of Indian foreign policy, that's a very interesting space to be a part of at this point. Because something clearly is changing. We have had structural change. We have had normative and institutional change. We have also seen political shift in this country. And that is having an impact on the way many in India and Indian strategic communities evaluating its response.
I think perhaps the premise of the book was a bit naive, if I can say so, because it supposes that a government formulates a foreign policy and then delivers it. The problem is events occur. Partners don't cooperate. Bad surprises arise. And often governments that had a particularly strong view of what they wanted to do wind up actually doing the contrary because of events and so on. So I wanted to ask you, to what extent, in your view, the current government of India has really been the master of its foreign policy, and to what extent it has been, in part, reactive to events?
Well, I think you have been part of the government, of the establishment, if you will, and you know that most of the time governments tend to sort of react. And in India, we have had this long-standing debate as to why is it that Indian foreign policy always tends to be very, very reactive. And I think some of the practitioners perhaps take a different view and articulate a response that, look, events, dear boy, events always take precedence. But I think the issue, from my perspective, as an outsider looking at the scope and expanse of this change, what is interesting is that in some ways, this government, because of the particular context and because of the political particular power balance that it emerged from, has been able to shift certain discourses. And there are 2 or 3 things that come to one's mind. You know, whether on a lot of the things you will have the what you are pointing out is perfectly valid, that you really can't do much about events and you have to react to some of these developments. But I think there has been an element of proactively shaping some of this discourse. As an analyst, I find it really interesting at this juncture. One of them, I think, has been this discourse on especially what do you do with your neighborhood? And can you really reimagine your strategic neighborhood? Can you reimagine your periphery? And I think this is a debate 5 years before. I mean, BIMSTEC existed long before this government. But we have not seen this extensive a debate on whether we should be really looking at our Bay of Bengal community and in linking it up to Southeast Asia. I think that's a debate that has been pressed upon Indian foreign policy establishment. And we have to acknowledge that there is something that has changed. We are now at least talking about it. I'm not saying that much has changed, for example, in operational terms. I think there are a lot of concerns that, despite all the talk, we are not actually investing in those institutional frameworks that we need to. But this discourse was missing 5 years before. You look at Middle East and the way the government has been able to juggle all the balls in the air, reaching out to, for example, Israel in the way that they've done, acknowledging publicly Mr. Modi going to Israel. I don't think, and as an analyst, I can perhaps articulate this, and I did even last year when Shashi was there, that I don't think for a Congress government it would have been possible. Only a BJP government could have done that. So I think there are certain things where the impact has been very, very visible. The discourse, for example, on China, I think the Doklam, whatever the outcome, it has been very interesting inflection point in the way it was handled. I think as an analyst, I found it for the first time, perhaps, in a crisis, Indian government was doing much better in terms of crisis management than Chinese government. You had the Chinese media going bollocks over what was happening and issuing threats every day. Indian management of the crisis was much better. So I think there have been a number of inflection points where you can see the debate has sort of shifted in ways which we would not have anticipated, which would not simply be explained by either structural or normative variables. Something in the leadership, something in the political calculus has mattered. And I think that is important because we need to understand the sources of the change. So it's not simply about that, well, yes, and I believe a lot in structural change, and I'm a firm believer that structure matters. And I saw a lot of the debate on Indian foreign policy is about, all right, India is now moving from 2 trillion economy to soon to 5 to 6 trillion economy, and therefore certain things are inevitable. I don't think that has often been the case, that economic growth in and of itself cannot be a strategy.
Let me mention 3 relationships with you. I think they have all not actually responded to the basic instincts of the government at the outset, and through no fault of the government. So, China, Russia, and the United States. None of them are exactly where I think probably the government would have liked them to be. The positive surprise being Russia, that actually has turned out much better than one might have imagined, while the other 2, for all sorts of reasons you know better than I, have turned out to be more difficult than might have been imagined.
Well, yes, and no. I think if you look at, for example, America, right? For the last 10 years, the debate on Comcasa was there. Under the 2 UPA governments, we were not able to move on Comcasa. And this government pushed the envelope on that. So I think the transition from Mr. Obama to Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump is a very difficult person to handle, as I'm sure we know. And I think the transition has been quite seamless. I think There are many problems. I think we were discussing that before. If you look at, there is a lot of debate in India on what Mr. Trump has said on India's support to Afghanistan, libraries and what is India doing. But if you see the entire sort of conversation, entire press conference, he's very positive about India. It's a very positive press conference about India. So I think the Indian engagement and only Mr. Modi can go to US Congress and say, look, hesitations of history are over. I don't think, I mean, it looks that speech is very powerful, partly because it conveys an inflection point that we have sort of moved over a cliff. I don't think, it's not a partisan point, but I don't think a Congress party prime minister would go to a US Congress and say hesitations of history are over. I don't think it would be possible.
Good, okay. So now, Samir said we could go slightly over time, so I'm going to do that with your permission. The front of the room has been rather well served. Is there anybody in the back of the room that would like I think not. So ma'am, at this table, your hand was up first. Could you identify yourself? There should be a microphone at your table. And be very brief.
I will. My name is Lata Reddy. I'm a former diplomat and one of the people responsible for the black box of Indian foreign policy. And Harsh and I are old friends. I just want to very briefly say, Harsh, that on 3 points that you made, on BIMSTEC and ASEAN, on non-alignment 2.0, and on Israel, I have different viewpoints, because I think on BIMSTEC and ASEAN...
I think you may need to speak closer to the
I think
microphone.
BIMSTEC and ASEAN, let me point out that there was 20 years of steady, sustained work on BIMSTEC and on ASEAN, and it's not something that suddenly flowered today, you know. So I think to look at it purely in terms of what this government has done would be wrong. Secondly, on non-alignment 2.0, if you, in the book, it talked about strategic autonomy, which is exactly what this government is talking about. So while they may not use the term non-alignment, they've adopted the idea of non-alignment 2.0, which was strategic autonomy.
Right.
On the third issue, Israel, I agree with you. I think it was only this government that could have done what they did.
Thank you, ma'am. We'll take that as a comment, and we'll now give the floor to you, sir.
My name is General Ashok Mehta. Hi, David.
Hi, Ashok.
Hi, Harsh. You talked about the reorientation of the strategic neighborhood. Will it be correct to assume that this government has succeeded in isolating Pakistan? And when this, is this a transitory phase, or the isolation of Pakistan by shifting from SAARC to BIMSTEC and to looking east and acting east will permanently keep Pakistan out of the region?
Great. That's a question. So.
Well, I wish I had the answer. I mean, I would be a very important person indeed. I think, I'm basically an academic, and when I'm looking at some of these debates, what I find interesting as an academic is that 5 years back, we were not taking BIMSTEC seriously. So the issue is not that BIMSTEC was not there. The issue is the political leadership trying to manage it differently? And I think that's a reality. That we do see a lot of emphasis being put on it, partly because there are other constraints that it may be that Pakistan policy is not working. So let's also reinvigorate the other side. But I think that shift is interesting, because it's a very, from my perspective, a very proactive sort of approach to, yes, there is a problem on the Western frontier. What do we do about it? Can we just keep on with this lament that, yes, it's a problem, let's see what we can do. Oh, it's not working out, SAARC is dead. But I think to then move from there to say, look, there is an alternative. Let's see if that alternative works. And I think in terms of academia, in terms of those of us who study this subject, I find this interest in trying to reimagine your strategic geography as a very fascinating aspect of a change, of a shift, which to me is a shift, which to me is a change in the way we have looked at Indian foreign policy, at least in the neighborhood. And therefore, I think I would agree that Pakistan has of course taken a lot of the diplomatic capital from the government, and we do see a lot of focus wherever the Prime Minister goes, wherever the External Affairs Minister goes, and Pakistan's isolation is a big part of the diplomatic engagement. But again, to me, that's perhaps even the previous governments were doing that. But what is interesting is what this government wants to do about it, and I think what has done about it. That to me, this shift, that yes, this is a problem, let's shift to the other side and see whether we can engage with BIMSTEC, with the Bay of Bengal community more distinctly, more impressively, and also to re-envision India's role. That look, you cannot keep on saying that our neighborhood is this. So if you can say, look, if you use Bay of Bengal community and start linking to Southeast Asia, you have an entirely different strategic periphery that we are talking about. So that expands India's sort of imagination of itself, of its own role in the neighborhood, in ways that I think would yield benefits to India, in my humble opinion. And I think if that shift happens operationally, it has happened ideationally, if it happens operationally, I think that would be a significant shift in terms of our imagination of our own role in the region, as well as in the larger periphery from Indian Ocean to all the way to Southeast Asia.
Great. Harsh, thank you very much. It's now quite late. Ashok, thank you for that. I think what we'll do is call this to a close. Harsh, I look forward actually now to getting the book. What you've done is very brave, because this is a mid-course assessment in all likelihood. And so in a way, you've tackled bravely something that most authors would have left for a longer term assessment, I think. And so I think you personally are a great acquisition for ORF. They're very lucky to have you. I think your publisher is fortunate to have the book. It should sell very well. And I do want to thank Samir and all of his wonderful colleagues who put on these meetings. A tremendous amount of work goes into them, much of them by young people. Samir has the capacity to inspire young people, which I admire hugely. And so with that, I want to thank you, Harsh, for this. I want to thank Steve and Christine, the Prime Minister, also for sharing what they've been writing about. And I hope that you'll be able to get your hands on some of the books at least. And Christine's publisher has been on hand today, and her books are available right now.